There are moments in aviation history that come with an unspoken rule. No survivors. This was one of them. At cruising altitude, high above Europe, a commercial aircraft suddenly stopped being an airplane and became debris. Not during takeoff, not during landing, but in the calmest phase of flight, where nothing is supposed to happen. The explosion was instant, the breakup violent, the fall inevitable. At 80 without protection, without control, the human body doesn't endure. Physics doesn't allow it. Investigators would later agree on one thing almost immediately. Survival was impossible. The search operation that followed wasn't about rescue. It was about recovery. And yet, hours later, something was found that forced everyone involved to rethink what impossible really means. The most unsettling part wasn't the explosion. It was who it happened to. Not a trained test pilot. Not a stunt performer. Just a regular person, working a routine shift, expecting a normal day in the air. No premonition. No warning. No heroic preparation. In fact, this flight wasn't even supposed to be theirs. A simple scheduling detail placed them on that aircraft, at that altitude, on that exact route. Friends would later say there was nothing remarkable about them at all, and that's precisely what makes this story uncomfortable. Because if this could happen to someone ordinary, someone like this, then the line between normal life and absolute catastrophe is thinner than anyone likes to admit. There was no warning from the cockpit, no gradual descent into chaos. One moment, the aircraft was stable, cutting cleanly through the sky. The next, a violent shock tore through the fuselage. A bomb hidden in the cargo compartment detonated without mercy, ripping the plane apart at more than 30,000 feet. Passengers never had time to understand what was happening. The cabin decompressed instantly. Sections of the aircraft separated and began falling on their own trajectories, tumbling into the void below. Radar screens went silent. Radio contact vanished. For air traffic control, the flight didn't crash, it simply ceased to exist. And from that altitude, whatever followed was not a fall. It was a terminal descent. What followed wasn't a single failure, but a cascade. The aircraft broke apart meaning there was no controlled descent, no emergency landing, no structural integrity left to absorb impact. Pieces of the fuselage spun independently, accelerating as they fell. Temperatures at that altitude were well below freezing. Oxygen was gone. Consciousness should have followed within seconds. Even if someone remained alive during the fall, which already defied biology's. Terrain below made the odds worse. Dense forest. Snow-covered ground, no open fields, no water to soften impact. Every variable stacked neatly against life. Investigators would later say that changing even one of these factors might have altered the outcome. But all of them, together, that combination had never produced a survivor before. Not once. The fall ended in a dense, frozen forest, far from roads, far from witnesses. One of the largest sections of wreckage slammed into the ground with a force no human body is meant to endure. Trees snapped. Metal folded. Silence followed. For investigators, this was the final point of the story, the moment where survival officially became zero. But this is where the record breaks. Because inside that debris, something didn't fit the conclusion. If this story already feels unreal, stay with it, because what rescuers found next wasn't supposed to exist. And understanding how it happened is what makes this case truly absurd. When search teams reached the crash site, they weren't looking for movement. They were cataloging remains. But deep inside a section of the fuselage, something forced them to stop. There were signs of life. Not imagined, not hopeful. Real. A flight attendant, still strapped to part of the aircraft's interior, had survived the fall. Against altitude, impact, and cold, she was breathing, severely injured, barely conscious but alive. If you're wondering how that's even possible, you're asking the same question investigators asked that day, because this single detail, her position inside the wreckage, would become the key to explaining what should never have happened. Medical teams were stunned. From a clinical standpoint, her survival made no immediate sense. The injuries alone should have been fatal: multiple fractures, internal trauma, extreme hypothermia. Doctors initially assumed there had been a mistake in the reports. Some believed she must have fallen from a much lower altitude. Others suspected parts of the story were being exaggerated in the chaos after the crash. But flight data, radar records, and debris patterns confirmed the truth. She had fallen from cruising altitude. Specialists in aviation medicine, trauma, physics, and human tolerance reviewed the case independently, and none could offer a quick explanation. The numbers didn't work. The models failed. For once, experience had no answer. As the shock faded, documentation took over. Investigators reconstructed the breakup of the aircraft using black box data, radar traces, and thousands of fragments scattered across the mountainside. Every detail was logged, photographed, and cross-checked. Her location in the wreckage, the angle of descent, even the way the trees were broken beneath the impact, were carefully analyzed. Medical reports were added to the file, confirming injuries consistent with a high-altitude fall. There was no dispute left to hide behind. This wasn't a myth or a The official conclusion was clear. The event occurred exactly as described, and the survival was real. The case was archived, but never truly resolved. What finally brought clarity wasn't luck alone, but physics working in an unexpected way. The section of the fuselage she was attached to acted like a crude parachute, increasing drag and slowing the fall, just enough to reduce terminal velocity. As it descended, it struck treetops, each impact shaving off energy before reaching the ground. Snow-covered terrain absorbed more force than solid earth would have. Her seat position distributed the remaining impact across the body rather than concentrating it in one fatal point. None of this guaranteed survival, but together, it made it possible. Not miraculous, not supernatural, just a rare alignment of variables that almost never occur at the same time. Years later, this case still sits uncomfortably in aviation history. Not because the explanation is weak, but because it's strong. Every variable has a name. Every injury has a cause. Every conclusion is backed by data. And yet, the human mind resists it. We're used to believing that reality has clean boundaries, that some events simply end stories. This one didn't. The woman was Vesna Vulovio, a flight attendant aboard Jet Flight 367. In 1972, her aircraft was destroyed by a bomb over what is now the Czech Republic. She fell from over 33,000 feet and survived, still holding the Guinness World Record for the highest fall without a parachute. Recovery took years. Her career ended. Her life changed permanently. Survival didn't mean victory. It meant adaptation. What makes this story unsettling isn't that it lacks logic, but that it exposes how fragile our assumptions are. The margin between life and death wasn't courage or instinct, it was position, structure, terrain, and timing. Factors no one can control, and no one can repeat on command. This wasn't proof that humans can defy physics. It was proof that physics sometimes allows exceptions so narrow they feel impossible. And that is the uncomfortable truth. The world isn't designed around what we expect to survive. Every now and then, reality leaves the door open just enough for someone to walk back through it.